This is Lincoln, a beautiful English city where I first learned what it meant to be outcast, and how simple and straightforward it can be to help people back to a fulfilled life. And I learned all this from my own experience. Many people will tell you that homelessness and poverty result from drug addiction, laziness, bad character, whatever that actually means, or generally being scum. They think that the world is essentially fair and that society, God, the universe, or whatever would never allow good people to fall so low. In critical thinking circles, there's actually a name for this attitude. It's known as the just world fallacy. It's useful psychologically because it helps people not to feel too bad about walking by on the other side, about coming out of church and doing the exact opposite of the Good Samaritan. They see people less fortunate than themselves, less able to negotiate the opportunities that always seem to go to the wealthy, and they wonder why such people become disparaged, hopeless and helpless, in a world that didn't just bring them low, but then rejected them, and continues to reject them day after day, week after week, and year after year. I'm here in Lincoln, retracing my steps of all those years ago to consider just how realistic this assumption might be. It's not exactly a pretty story, but it might be a revealing one, especially if you're one of those people who think that continued homelessness and the despair and desperation that accompanies it has nothing to do with circumstance. I left school and joined the workforce, or rather the employment age population, in 1981. Thatcher's Britain was just getting started, but already jobs were becoming scarcer in the industrial north where I was born. After years of unemployment, or government temporary job creation schemes that really amounted to little more than subsistence pay employment, the kind of compulsory near-slavery subsidising the profits of organisations, I got my first proper job. I worked in retail. The only problem was, I hated it. It just wasn't the job for me. But as a working class lad in a previously industrialised area, by now an unemployment black spot, I had little option but to grin and bear it. Until one day, after almost 2 years of what for me was a soul-destroying existence, I decided to follow Cabinet Minister Norman Tebbett's advice to get on my bike and look for work. I didn't really have a plan. I hadn't travelled particularly at that age and almost never alone. But nonetheless, full of determination and self-resolve, I strapped my guitar to the back of my rucksack and hitched a lift with the store's delivery driver, Dennis. Dennis was a cheery bloke. He'd been a driver for most of his life, and he loved it. He had his schedules to meet, but on the whole, people left him alone with his radio, his cab, and a little TV for nights spent on the road. Dennis was on his way down to Grantham, Mrs. Thatcher's birthplace, as I later learned, and 4 hours or so later I clambered out of Dennis's cab and looked around. What the hell had I done? The first night I copped out and stayed in a bed and breakfast in Newark. I'd never slept rough before and I really didn't fancy the prospect. I mean, that was fine, but I couldn't do that forever. I hadn't enough money to stay in B&Bs very often. So began a life of sleeping out and busking for coppers. I'd expected that the pickings for a street singer would be pretty good in the affluent south. Little did I know that Nottinghamshire was hit just as badly as my native West Cumbria. I didn't even know that Nottinghamshire wasn't really the south. It was a long way south for me. These were Midlands mining communities, very like those back home, and they were in a mess too. I won't labour on the time I spent out of doors. When you've seen one park bench, you've pretty much seen them all. The interesting thing for me was what happened next. It was what happened when I eventually found my way here, to Lincoln. My first port of call was Lincoln YMCA. A fairly small hostel at the time, although it soon expanded with the addition of a large annex, bringing the total to 96 beds plus staff accommodation. The Y took me in, even though I had no money to pay them. They fed me on account, gave me a room and the luxury of a proper bed to sleep in. And they helped me to complete the DHSS, now DWP, claim forms for social security payments and housing benefit. That claim typically took around 6 weeks to process, and the Y let me stay there on trust. They let all of us stay there on trust until our money came through and we paid them what we owed.
When I got to the front door for the first time, Dean Bell was on duty. And I knocked and said, "Can I help?" I said, "Yeah, I'm looking for a room for the night." He said, "Do you have any money?" And I said, "No." He said, "Well, you better come in then." And I'm like, "What do you mean?" He says, "We can sort something out." And he gave me the spiel, told me about signing on this, that and the other. And I was allotted a room. And I'm like, "As easy as that?" And he went, "As easy as that. Have you eaten?" And I went, "Yeah, I've just had a bag of chips." He says, "Where from?" I said, "Broadgate Chip." He said, "You could have brought me some."
I could have taken the money and ran. Some did exactly that, leaving the hostel to try to make up for 6 weeks of lost income at a time when the Salvation Army was closing a hostel a week because of funding problems. That was a big risk the Lincoln YMCA took to support its newcomers. By the time I made it to the Y, I'd seen some pretty harrowing things. I'd been scared so much that anxiety had become a kind of habit, and I was more than a little paranoid. Looking back, it's clear that the staff at the hostel must have seen the signs, no matter how much I tried to hide them, because they all made me feel at ease. There were lads who'd faced such early trauma that they risked being permanently scarred as a result. Emotional instability was commonplace, and depression, anger problems, even psychosis were never too far away. Almost all felt the cruelty of social stigma.
I always remember you saying about getting low. Literally, I got to the point, and I've still got a scar on my wrist. I was going to, and it was one person that we all know, Tara,
Oh yeah.
who literally knocked on my door. I'd opened the door and she saw what I'd been going to do, and at the time, she slapped me across the face and said one of the kindest things she said: "Don't leave me." Because we were just friends.
Yeah.
There was nothing ever happening.
I get that.
You know, but as a friend, she said, "Just don't leave me." And that stopped me.
I was one of the most fortunate here. I hadn't run away from abuse. I'd just been bored with my job and too stubborn to go back home when things got tough. I didn't have anyone back home ready to hurt me or humiliate me, and I wasn't trying to escape an abusive partner or parent, although many did. Several of the lads I met in the hostel are dead now, some by their own hand, others because of lifestyle. One young man took a dangerous job on a trawler to escape the dole and died on his first proper trip out. The boat whose crew he'd joined, the Pescado, wasn't seaworthy, and it sank with all hands off the south coast. My friend Jim pawned his record collection to hire a car, and we, together with a former resident, Mick, somehow found the money for petrol and shared the long night drive to Plymouth for the memorial service one cold morning. Other residents took back-breaking piecework in Lincolnshire fields, bringing in harvest for a few months each year. Some even worked briefly as extras on the movie Memphis Belle. Quite a few lads earned decent but infrequent money taking part in police lineups. More than one of the hostel residents simply drank themselves to death, and at least 2 seemed just to have disappeared without a trace. But they were good lads. They just had problems and no effective way to find a place in a society that saw poverty as failure and mental health problems as a character flaw. Without really knowing it, the hostel staff provided a validating environment that would be the envy of many mental health units I know. No matter how stigmatized residents were in the outside world, inside the hostel, we were respected and valued. We were treated as equals, and we were expected to do well. I've seen some people give up on life in those days, but many more managed to pull themselves up by their bootstraps because of the confident air of expectation provided by their environment. YMCA residents weren't treated as second-class citizens, and so we didn't act like it. I don't remember exactly when my anxiety became under control, but I know that it did. So much so that I was actually employed by the hostel as night porter. It wasn't the most glamorous job in the world, but it gave me a leg up and got me back into the jobs market. I often used to make an arduous morning walk up Steep Hill to Lincoln Cathedral and the tranquillity of the Lady Chapel, where I'd reflect on the previous night, and thank God I'd made it through. Those were the days when I still believed, despite all I'd seen. Others helped to find voluntary places, also secured paid work in time. Many who had suffered from what I now recognise as diagnosable mental disorders overcame their problems and made their way into the world because of the nurturing, but not too cosseting environment of Lincoln YMCA. Treat people with dignity, respect their humanity, expect them to succeed, and help them to overcome whatever practical hurdles they face. In short, do what they used to do at Lincoln YMCA.